Tokyo. Late August 1945. A gray morning leaks through the blinds of a shuttered Navy Ministry office. Paper smells of dust and damp. A staff officer turns the stiff pages of captured American registers and wartime summaries, his pencil ticking in the margin like a metronome. Names, ratings, hull numbers. Training stations he has never seen. Fleets that did not seem possible in 1941 now crowd the columns. Escort carriers, destroyer escorts, oilers, repair ships, tenders, each with crews, reliefs, and schools behind them. The totals run into 7 digits. Far beyond the tidy pre-war estimates that had comforted planning rooms, when a few 100,000 sailors seemed the upper bound of America's sea power. The officer lays the pencil flat. Outside the city is quiet, wounded. Inside the arithmetic is not. Every added school means a pipeline. Every oiler means reach. Every name means another watch rotation that never ran out. It wasn't one fleet that defeated Japan. It was the ability to create fleets faster than they could be sunk. To see how such a gap opened, from neat projections to overwhelming reality, we have to return to the assumptions that shaped both navies before the shooting began. Before the war's thunder, there were treaties, tables, and theories. In 1922 at Washington, the world's naval powers fixed ratios that seemed to freeze strength in place. 5 to 5 to 3 for battleships and carriers, United States, Britain, Japan. London followed in 1930 with further ceilings. On paper the arithmetic looked final. In Tokyo's Naval General Staff, planners absorbed the numbers into a doctrine already decades old. Fight one decisive battle in home waters after whittling down an approaching U.S. fleet. A fleet built for one culminating Mahanian collision could, they believed, offset inferior tonnage with superior training, night fighting, and torpedo craft. The doctrine had roots, geography, fuel, and industry. The Pacific is an ocean of distance. Every mile from California to the Western Pacific stretches a logistics rope that can be cut. If the U.S. came west, Japanese planners reasoned, its battle line must cross thousands of miles of submarine screens, cruiser ambushes, and air strikes launched from island bastions. The nearer it came to the Philippines or Formosa, the nearer it came to the striking power of the combined fleet operating under land-based air cover. The arithmetic of distance seemed to favor the defender. Intelligence estimates reflected this logic. Japanese officers read Jane's registers, watched American keel-laying announcements, tracked appropriations bills, and focused on hulls. Men were counted in crew tables attached to ships. Sailors were functionally synonymous with platforms. A few 100,000 seemed to cover the active Navy and its immediate shore support, enough to run the battle line, carriers, auxiliaries, and bases. The manpower behind training pipelines, replacement pools, shipyard shifts, and schoolhouses, those were rarely integrated as strategic variables. What mattered, in the calculus of Kantai-Kessen, was who could bring a battle fleet intact to the decisive sea. By the mid-1930s the treaty scaffolding began to shake. Japan left the treaty system in 1936, pursued new battleships and carriers, and folded aviation into its concept of attrition and ambush. Its sailors drilled hard. Torpedo squadrons perfected night attacks around the oxygen-fueled Type 93. Cruisers mastered long-range gunnery. Carrier air groups trained brutally. Flight hours were precious because fuel was finite, but standards remained exacting for the best. The officer corps believed qualitative edge would compensate for quantitative limits. Across the ocean, the United States adjusted at a different tempo. The Naval Act of 1938 nudged expansion. Then in July 1940, the Two-Ocean Navy Act authorized an unprecedented increase: new carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliaries. It did not conjure ships overnight. But it opened the sluice gates of appropriations, contracts, and yard work that would soon pour steel onto the slips in Newport News, Brooklyn, Mare Island, Puget Sound, and dozens of satellite yards. The American state had not yet mobilized its manpower fully, but the blueprint for volume existed. Japanese assessments noted the act, tracked hull counts, and updated tables. Yet the doctrinal lens stayed fixed. A larger American fleet still had to cross the Pacific and be beaten near Japan's chosen waters. The decisive battle school assumed a pacing problem on the American side: slow mobilization, political caution, and thin forward basing. Oil, the Japanese knew, was the hinge. Japan imported most of its petroleum, much of it from the United States before 1941. War would tighten the tap. But in planning, fuel scarcity paradoxically drove the belief in rapid, preclusive victory: strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the outset, seize a defensive perimeter, and force a negotiated peace before American industry and manpower could fully awaken. This intellectual frame shaped personnel estimates. The fleet sailor was the unit of account. Shore establishments were background, not foreground. Training system capacity was minimally modeled because Japan's own pipelines were narrow and intensely selective. Projecting that structure onto America produced an undercount. In 1941, the U.S. Navy on active duty numbered in the hundreds of thousands, not millions. That snapshot seemed to validate the estimate. What it missed was velocity, the rate at which a democratic industrial society could turn appropriations into schools, schools into ratings, ratings into crews, and crews into operating task forces sustained at sea without pause. Pearl Harbor did not erase the doctrine, it triggered it. The raid sought exactly what the decisive battle logic required: to cripple the battle line, disrupt American operational reach, and buy time for the perimeter to harden. From Tokyo's vantage, December 1941 confirmed the model. A stunning tactical blow, a shocked opponent, a window to impose costs on any counteroffensive across a vast maritime chessboard. Counting hulls and crews still made sense, so long as the war could be concluded before numbers compounded. But in America, the blow unlocked the full machinery of mobilization. Congress extended the draft. Training centers exploded in size. New ratings were invented to match new technologies: radar, sonar, repair, replenishment. Merchant shipbuilding fused with naval requirements to create an integrated base of sea power. The scale was not visible in December. It would become visible in 1942 and unmistakable in 1943, when the pipeline of men and ships turned estimates into anachronisms. Which is where the story must go next. From pre-war arithmetic and doctrinal assumptions to the lived reality of mobilization, training, and logistics that turned columns of numbers into fleets that did not tire. Mobilization is not a speech. It is a map of railheads and water towers, a ledger of billets and bunks, a schedule of wakes and mess hours, the chalk dust of instructors, and the hum of switchboards linking pier to pier. In early 1942, as the United States absorbed Pearl Harbor and reorganized under Admiral Ernest J. King as Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet, the Navy turned blueprints into rhythms. Training commands multiplied and specialized. Great Lakes expanded into a city of uniforms on Lake Michigan. San Diego, Norfolk, and Newport pulsed day and night. New inland schools, Sampson in New York, Farragut in Idaho, converted raw recruits into rated men. The syllabus widened. Gunnery and seamanship, yes, but also radio, radar, sonar, fire control, damage control, aviation ordnance, and the practical math of convoy organization. Every classroom hour unlocked a watch section. Every graduation class filled another crew roster. Shipyards fed the pipeline. The 1942 Ocean Navy Act began to reach the waterline in 1942-43. Essex-class carriers, Independence-class light carriers, and a broad phalanx of escort carriers slid down greased ways. Destroyers and destroyer escorts arrived in flocks. Oilers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels, often overlooked in pre-war estimates, filled out service force tables. The Navy and the Maritime Commission were distinct, but in practice their output formed one system of sea power. Liberty and Victory ships carried the tonnage, while naval auxiliaries sustained the fighting edge. The old habit of counting combatants only no longer described reality. A task force now included the shadow fleet of tenders, tugs, salvage ships, floating dry docks, and mobile depots, human ecosystems at sea. Nowhere did the scale first show its teeth more than around Guadalcanal. In August 1942, the United States committed a narrow margin of strength to seize and hold Henderson Field. 4 months, the fight staggered between night surface actions, Savo Island, Cape Esperance, Tassafaranga, and the daytime grind of air attacks and convoy runs. The Japanese ran destroyers as high-speed transports, burning precious fuel and crews to keep the Tokyo Express alive. The Americans learned hard lessons in radar employment, combat information centers, and damage control. But the deeper story was tempo. Replacement ships and men flowed into the South Pacific at a pace Japan could not match. Even as losses cut deep, cruisers smashed in the slot, transports sunk in Iron Bottom Sound, the American pipeline filled the gaps. A pattern appeared. Each month's attrition was answered with trained watchstanders and new hulls, while Japanese units bled experience that could not be regenerated. By 1943, the learning curve steepened into doctrine. Carrier task forces reorganized around cyclic operations: launch, recover, rearm, refuel, launch again. Radar-directed fighters and early warning net stabilized air defense. Combat information centers matured from cramped radio corners into the nerve centers of ships, integrating radar plots, lookout reports, and fighter direction in real time. The submarine force, once tentative, tightened into a campaign that severed Japanese shipping lanes, sinking tankers and freighters that were the lifeblood of industry and the bloodstream of the fleet. Each Japanese merchantman lost meant fewer flight hours, fewer destroyer sorties, fewer chances to train replacements. Strategy and logistics were now indivisible. Underway replenishment, concept, gear, and practice finished the transformation. Pre-war planning assumed that major fleets must retire to forward bases for fuel and ammunition. In 1943-44, the U.S. Navy perfected refueling, rearming, and reprovisioning at sea, while mobile service squadrons leapt from atoll to atoll. Floating dry docks assembled in blue lagoons. Tankers formed conveyor belts across the Pacific. What this meant to a staff officer counting sailors was profound. Each oiler and ammunition ship carried crews, each service squadron multiplied billets, and each mobile base required communications, medical, and repair ratings. The American fleet was not a line of battle alone. It was an archipelago of capability that moved. Leadership fused the parts. King enforced a ruthless priority. The Atlantic could not be starved, convoys to Britain were existential, but the Pacific would receive what it needed to keep an unbroken offensive. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz translated resources into operational design. Central Pacific thrusts through the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. Coordination with General MacArthur's advances along New Guinea and into the Philippines. This tempo demanded depth in men. Crews rotated without collapsing squadrons. Air groups replenished with trained pilots and maintainers who arrived in groups, not as isolated replacements. Damage control teams worked miracles because they had been taught to do so, with drills repeated until muscle remembered what panic would forget. Japanese estimates struggled to adjust. The frame through which the enemy had been measured, hulls, named fleets, assumed basing limits, could not easily accommodate an opponent that invented new categories of strength. The Imperial Navy still produced exceptional individual units and fought with skill, but its fuel crisis, merchant shipping losses, and training bottlenecks turned every victory into a one-time feat when the U.S. Navy reorganized into fast carrier task forces, each with its own replenishment group, and sent them back to sea again within days. The scale ceased to be an abstraction. It was a cadence. Sortie rates, sortie regeneration, the number of arrests a flight deck could perform in an afternoon, the number of engine changes a maintenance crew could complete before dawn. Numbers became time. By mid-1943 the outcome was not decided, but the direction was set. America's manpower system had migrated from mustering rooms to a maritime machine in which every rating had a place and every place had a relief. Japanese planners who had once expected a long, throttled advance now faced an adversary that attacked along multiple axes and did not pause to recover. The decisive battle, when it came, would not be a set-piece collision of battle lines in home waters. It would be a series of air-sea encounters in open ocean where proficiency, radar, fighter direction, and replenishment cycles decided the day. And that is where we must go next, to the human, technological, leadership, intelligence, tactical, and moral angles that explain how numbers became power and how power turned into dominance at sea. A recruit steps off a train at Great Lakes. The wind smells of cold iron and lake water. In weeks he will speak a new language, quarters, stations, ratings, and the Navy will carve his day into watches and drills. He is not alone. Trains arrive from Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, the Bronx. Barracks fill. Classrooms absorb the crowd and turn it into order. Instructors pin chalk diagrams of watertight integrity, DC lockers, sound-powered phones. Men learn to breathe through smoke hoods and crawl dark passageways counting frames by touch. A petty officer's voice cuts through panic. Repetition makes reflex. The American system does not look elegant. It looks noisy. It looks industrial. But it is forgiving of scale. If one instructor burns out, another steps in. If a class fails gunnery, it repeats until the sight picture settles. Aviation mechanics practice engine pulls on stands before touching a live carrier deck. Radiomen key until code becomes cadence. And when a destroyer needs a third watch for the third week at sea, the roster can take the strain because there is a relief behind the relief. Fatigue is managed by numbers. Skill is built by process. Across the ocean, Japanese sailors begin with rigor and pride. Standards are high. Night fighting is a craft. Torpedo doctrine is an art. But fuel is rationed. Flight hours thin. Wartime attrition takes instructors first, then graduates, then the students who would have replaced them. By 1943 the Imperial Navy struggles to maintain proficiency margins that once seemed permanent. Experienced petty officers vanish into the ocean's ledger. Replacement pilots arrive with fewer hours, fewer night traps, fewer gunnery runs. Human systems degrade from the edges inward. A single sailor's courage cannot slow that chemical reaction. It needs a reservoir of trained people to change the rate. On the American side, the reservoir overflows. New schools appear inland, Sampson, Farragut, so coastal threat cannot break the pipeline. Specialized courses bloom. Radar operators, CIC plotters, aviation ordnance men, metalsmiths, shipfitters. Each course breaks a complex task into teachable parts. Each part becomes a rating, a billet, a wage. The human angle in the end is simple. The United States built a machine for transforming citizens into sailors faster than losses could pull them apart. The Imperial Navy could not. That difference shows up in every later scene. Flight decks at dusk, damage control teams at midnight, and the calm of a watch that knows relief will arrive. At night in the slot the sky is black glass. Radar paints ghosts into tracks. A CIC officer leans over a grease pencil plot, headset tight, voice steady. Range, bearing, course, speed. The picture blooms in two dimensions that matter most, time and distance. Before the war, sight was eyesight and doctrine assumed surprise would favor the bold. By 1943, sight is electrons. Surprise belongs to the network that fuses antennas, talkers, and train decisions. American ships build that network into their bones, SG and later sets tied to doctrine, fighter direction teams layered with early warning from pickets and carriers. Technology here is not a single box. It is a system. Radar warns. Radios coordinate. The Combat Information Center turns fragments into timing. Then the flight deck makes timing into power. Cyclic operations demand choreography. Deck crews spot aircraft, elevators cycle weapons, ordnance lines flow like arteries, and oilers wait just beyond the horizon. Underway replenishment takes the miracle ashore and puts it underway, hoses stretching like nerves between hulls, groomsmen close alongside, fuel flowing while ships steer in parallel. Ammunition and food move the same way. Mobile base units assemble lagoons into factory floors, with floating dry docks swallowing destroyers whole and returning them to the line. Japanese pre-war doctrine assumed basing cycles and finite radii of action. Technology erases those edges for the Americans. A task force becomes self-extending. It can remain on station long enough for attrition to express its logic. Each day at sea is another round of training for green pilots, another set of traps, another patrol flown, another radar watch refined by practice. Japanese carriers, constrained by fuel and logistics, cannot offer the same rehearsal. Their pilots fly fewer hours. Their destroyers burn oil they cannot replace. When technology is harnessed to endurance, its advantage compounds. This is not a tale of gadgets deciding battles by themselves. It is a story of integration. The radar set matters because a rating learns to trust it. The CIC matters because it disciplines thought under pressure. The oiler matters because it moves the battle line's calendar from must retire to ready tomorrow. From Guadalcanal to the Central Pacific, the side that sees first and sustains longer dictates tempo. Tempo decides where risk lands. And by 1944, risk is landing on the Imperial Navy's flight decks faster than they can clear them. In Washington, Admiral Ernest J. King keeps his desk clean and his priorities violent. He insists on economy of time. No idle hulls. No sacred cows. Convoys in the Atlantic remain non-negotiable, but the Pacific must receive enough to attack without pause. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz receives ships and turns them into plans that turn into places. The Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas. The sequence looks inevitable in retrospect. At the time it is a bet on capacity. Each leap needs escorts, carriers, submarines, and, less glamorous, enough oilers and repair ships to make the next leap feasible. Leadership here is not rhetoric. It is the assignment of scarcity. Japanese leadership contains brilliance of a different kind. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understands America's industrial potential and the danger of a long war. His instincts are offensive, his timing audacious. Midway exposes the fragility beneath audacity. A staff system stretched by complexity, a doctrinal attachment to the decisive battle that misreads American risk tolerance once replenishment becomes routine. After Yamamoto's death, successors confront a narrowing corridor. Less fuel, fewer trained air crews, more submarine sinkings. Decisions occur inside a shrinking envelope of choices. American leaders make choices that grow choices. King clears bureaucratic thickets to prioritize carriers and logistics ships. Nimitz empowers subordinates, Spruance, Mitchell Turner, Kelly Turner's amphibious teams, to specialize and iterate. Mistakes are mined for procedure. Fighter direction improves. Damage control becomes catechism. On the Japanese side, courage is not lacking. Ships charge into night actions with resolve. But strategic leadership is now enslaved to logistics. Without oil, genius lives in the realm of the theoretical. Leadership shows up finally in schedule. Who chooses when to fight and for how long? By 1944, American admirals choose. They can remain on station through weather. They can launch second and third strikes after noon. They can disengage to refuel and return in days, not weeks. That calendar control is leadership expressed as logistics. Logistics expressed as manpower, manpower expressed as time. And time is the medium in which the next, harsher comparisons will be drawn. Japanese naval intelligence entered the Pacific War with methods that had worked in peacetime. Track appropriations, track keels, read registers, parse exercises, and infer crews from established complements. The focus was material. The unit of account was the ship. Even after the 1942 Ocean Navy Act signaled volume, pre-war and early war estimates still framed U.S. manpower as the sum of crews needed to operate listed hulls and a modest shore establishment. It overlooked the multiplying effect of schools, training squadrons, depot ships, service squadrons, and mobile bases, categories that scarcely existed in comparable form or scale in Japan's own system. When early American losses suggested a finite force that might be husbanded carefully, the model appeared validated. By 1943, signal intercepts and operational contact produced contradictions. Carrier air groups regenerated faster than expected. Destroyer squadrons seemed endless. Escort carriers appeared with convoy groups on both oceans while fast carriers roamed the Central Pacific. Each observation demanded a revision, and each revision broke the old constraint. The decisive battle school had assumed that America would ration risk because it must ration replacement. Instead, the United States absorbed tactical losses and returned within weeks with trained crews and fresh hulls. Intelligence could count what it saw, task groups, carrier decks crowded with aircraft, but it struggled to see what made those images routine, the training base and the service force. After the war, when the Navy Ministry handled captured documents and personnel totals, the gap between estimate and reality resolved to arithmetic. The United States had not fielded merely a large fleet. It had built a human system sized for persistent operations on two oceans, with more than 2 million naval personnel in uniform by the end. Intelligence had not been blind. It had been bounded by a model that could not imagine a fleet whose shadow, in schools and service squadrons, was larger than its silhouette at sea. That failure of imagination shaped the tactical battles to come. On the map, tactics look like arrows. At sea, tactics are cycles measured in hours. The American Fast Carrier Force, Task Force 58 in early 1944, redesignated 38 later, mastered the cycle. Launch at first light. Fighters out front. Bombers and torpedo planes behind. Recover, rearm, refuel, relaunch by midday. Adjust fighter direction through radar plots and voice nets. Tankers wait beyond the threat perimeter. Destroyers peel off to drink and return. With mobile service squadrons pushing forward, and attack, Majuro, Ulithi, the carriers carry their base with them. Each day at sea is another inning in which inexperienced pilots become competent and competent pilots become instructors, without the deck ever going cold for long. Japanese carriers fight hard and their air crews are brave. But fuel narrows practice. Losses remove instructors. Shipping losses starve bases. Destroyers spent as transports or pickets cannot be spared as screens. Night surface doctrine, brilliant in 1942, yields diminishing returns against radar-directed gunfire and improving American torpedo tactics. The submarine campaign operates as a second, relentless tactic. Sink tankers, then everything else. Without oil, sorties shrink. Without freighters, airstrips wither. Without escorts, convoys become targets. Each tactical success for the United States adds training hours for tomorrow. Each Japanese tactical success costs irreplaceable experience. The difference crystallizes in sortie math. By 1944, an American task group can generate multiple strike packages in a day and repeat the pattern for days, then refuel in formation and extend the fight. Japanese carriers, once emptied, must retire to scarce fuel and fragile bases under the threat of submarines. Tactical skill matters. So do radar, fighter control, and gunnery. But the decisive factor is the ability to repeat the action sooner than the enemy can recover. Thus tactics become logistics in motion, and logistics become a clock that only one side winds fully. Behind every flight deck is a factory floor, a union hall, a training field, and a household. American mobilization did not merely conscript men, it reorganized a society. Shipyards ran 3 shifts. Inland plants produced turbines, radios, and radar sets with defect rates driven down by statistical control. Women entered trades from riveting to radio assembly. Black Americans pressed for and won footholds in skilled labor and naval ratings long closed. The moral energy of a democracy at war is not simple or pure. Strikes occurred, discrimination persisted, and sacrifice was uneven. But the aggregate result was a workforce that increased throughput month after month. When a carrier burned, the question in Washington was not if it could be replaced in time. It was when and how many more could be laid down while replacing it. Japan also mobilized intensely and bore staggering burdens. Its people endured rationing, its factories worked under air raid threat, and its sailors fought with devotion. But the economic base was narrower. Strategic resources, especially oil and bauxite, were imported across seas increasingly patrolled by enemy submarines and aircraft. Choices tightened. The moral calculus of total war pressed both societies. For the United States, the blockade and strategic bombing of Japan promised to shorten the war at a terrible civilian cost. For Japan, continuing the war promised honor and the preservation of national autonomy at the price of national exhaustion. Within that harsh frame, the American Navy's growth reflected not just money or metal, but a civic decision to sustain losses and keep faith with an offensive that would not pause. The meaning of numbers thus becomes ethical as well as operational. A fleet that can rotate crews avoids burning out men to the nub. A training base that deepens skills reduces panic mistakes that kill. Economic scale allowed the United States to spare time for training and still attack. That moral surplus, time enough to prepare, would converge with technology and leadership in a few battles where pace and proficiency decided the outcome. The convergence arrives on a June morning over blue water, where tens of thousands of miles of rail, wire, and hose express themselves in contrails and wake lines. June 19, 1944. Central Pacific. Dawn pulls a pale line across a flat blue sea. To the west lie the Marianas, Saipan already burning under American landings begun on June 15. To the east, spread across hundreds of square miles, Admiral Mark A. Mitcher's Task Force 58 turns into the wind and brings the flight decks alive. Above this moving city, radar scopes warm, combat information centers come on headset, fighter directors test nets. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, has one clear imperative: protect the Saipan lodgment. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, leading the Japanese mobile fleet on AGO operation orders, must break the invasion with the air arm that once stunned the world. What meets over the Philippine Sea is not simply pilots and planes, it is 2 systems of time. Ozawa carries 9 carriers and a bold plan, but fuel is thin, aircrew experience thinner, and the submarine threat constant. Mitcher commands 4 Essex-class carriers, 5 Independence-class light carriers, and a screen of fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, each plugged into a radar and fighter direction lattice that has matured since Guadalcanal. The Americans have more aircraft and better trained pilots, yet the decisive factor is repetition. The ability to generate cycles, maintain a coherent aerial picture, and keep the decks working while refueling groups wait just beyond the horizon. Shortly after 10 o'clock, radar picks up the first inbound Japanese strike groups, launched at long range to keep outside the reach of American counterstrikes. Ground-controlled intercept has moved to sea. Vectors ripple from CICs to fighter squadrons of F-6F Hellcats orbiting high. The big blue blanket unrolls. Hellcats dive in organized sections, breaking up formations before they reach the ships. Below, the new battleships of the fast screen, South Dakota, Indiana, North Carolina, Washington, and others, stand ready, their directors linked to radar and their magazines full of VT-fused shells. Where 1942 saw captains squint into smoke and glare, 1944 sees talkers and plotters calling ranges that gunners trust. The first wave is torn apart well short of the carriers. A few attackers make it through. Near misses throw sheets of water over decks. A bomb slams into South Dakota and kills men below, but the screen holds and the CAP replenishes without panic. The second and third waves meet the same architecture. Radar warning, disciplined vectors, layered flak. The phrase that history will remember, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, does not capture the fear inside cockpits or the skill on both sides, but it reflects a truth. American aircrew proficiency and network defense have climbed while Japanese proficiency and coordination have fallen. A day that might once have cost the US a carrier now costs Japan the experienced air groups it cannot replace. Even before the carrier duel takes shape, submarines write a separate chapter. At 8:10 USS Albacore finds the new fleet carrier Taiho. A single torpedo detonates, damage control falters, gasoline vapors build, and a catastrophic explosion later rips her open, the newest symbol of Japanese carrier power gone. Hours after, USS Kavala stalks Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, and delivers the fatal spread. Two of Ozawa's three big fleet carriers vanish below the horizon on a day when his pilots most need deck space and maintenance crews. No American carrier is sunk. By late morning the air is littered with wreckage. Japanese losses mount, scores of planes and, crucially, trained airmen. American losses are real but absorbable, with many aircraft ditching or damaged yet pilots rescued by an improving combat search and rescue apparatus that includes destroyers thrown forward to pluck men from the sea. The difference is not just who loses how many, it is who can do this again tomorrow. Michigan. Ozawa, even if he escapes with hulls, cannot regenerate his air groups at anything like the rate needed to affect the Saipan battle. June 20th brings the counterpunch. The Japanese fleet has pulled back, still within reach. As evening approaches, the radar picture and scouts finally give Mitchell a fix. Launching at such a distance pushes range and daylight. The decision carries risk. Recovering in darkness could cost more aircraft than combat. But doctrine and training allow a reach for the throat. Deck crews race. Hellcats, Avengers and Helldivers lift into the amber light and run west. They find the enemy at the edge of range. Attacks fall on the remaining carriers and escorts. Hayo takes torpedoes and burns. Chiyoda and other ships suffer bomb hits. Oilers and cruisers twist under near misses. The strike is not neat, long transit, scattered groups, but it is enough to turn victory into pursuit. Then the clock turns cruel. The sun slides. Fuel gauges sink. Mitchell faces the problem that separates a bold fleet from a brittle one. Bring them home in the dark or hold back next time and lose chances like this forever. He orders the lights turned on. In blackout seas, carriers string lamps along deck edges and point searchlights straight up, a glowing corridor in the night. Destroyers burn fuel to mark lanes. Radio discipline bends to mercy as talkers guide pilots down. Many aircraft ditch, some into the glow within range of rescuers. Losses are not small. But the risk taken says something essential about the American system. Confidence that tomorrow's decks will be manned, that fuel will arrive, that more aircraft will roll out, and that the fleet can accept damage today to ensure a habit of decisive reach. When daylight returns, the reckoning is statistical as well as human. Japan has lost 3 carriers, Taiho and Shokaku to submarines, Hayo to carrier aircraft, and upward of 400 to 500 aircraft over 2 days when land-based losses are added. The U.S. tally of aircraft lost, around 100, includes many to night recoveries, not combat. The landing on Saipan continues under a protective umbrella so thick that Japanese counterattacks from the air have become episodic, not sustained. Ozawa's mobile fleet is still afloat in part, but its air arm, the irreplaceable core, is broken. What changes from this point is tempo. In 1942, a Japanese carrier force defeated could recover while the Americans paused to rebuild. In 1944, the Americans do not pause. Underway replenishment groups refuel, rearm, and redistribute air groups. Ulithi and other mobile anchorages step forward. Pilots who landed at night tell their stories to the next briefing room so the next risk is taken with eyes open. The Pacific War's decisive battle logic has not vanished. It has been replaced by a rolling decision, expressed in sorties per day over weeks. The road from the Marianas leads to a strait where 4 separate battles erupt over 3 days, and where the last illusions about parity die under a sky crowded with American planes and a sea full of submarines. October 23 to 26, 1944. The Philippines. An invasion force moves toward Leyte to cut Japan's southern resource lifeline. The U.S. Army wants beaches. The U.S. Navy must give them a horizon free of enemy battle flags. Admiral William F. Halsey's 3rd Fleet, Fast Carrier Task Force 38, ranges to the north and east, heavy with aircraft and confidence, while Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid's 7th Fleet, escorts, slow battleships and dozens of escort carriers, guards the amphibious lodgment. Opposite them, the Imperial Japanese Navy launches Operation Shogo, a 3-pronged strike to smash the beachhead and unhinge the American timetable. It is a plan of courage inside a vice of scarcity. The battle begins before the named engagements, in a straight channel of water and nerves. On October 23, U.S. submarines Darter and Dace ambush Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force in the Palawan Passage. Atago, his flagship, rolls under. Maya follows. Takao staggers home wounded. A fleet meant to deliver heavy gunfire into Leyte Gulf loses two of its long, hard cruising fists before the main event begins. The submarine's quiet arithmetic, patient tracking, correct lead, perfect angle on the bow, reminds both sides that every approach in 1944 runs a gauntlet staffed by trained crews who have done this many times. October 24, Sibuyan Sea. American scouts find Kurita again. Task groups launch in relays. Helldivers knife down on battleship silhouettes. Musashi, sister to Yamato and a floating symbol of decisive battle power, drinks torpedo after torpedo, bomb after bomb. She will not reach Leyte. Kurita turns away through curtains of rain and smoke. To the north, Halsey's flyers find a separate Japanese force. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force with carriers that look like opportunity and smell like bait. The decoy is real. Empty decks masking thin air groups, meant to pull the fast carriers away from Leyte and open a road for Kurita. It works because it is plausible. In 1942, Japanese carriers were the war's edge. In 1944, the image still draws the eye. Between the islands of Surigao and Leyte, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura brings his southern force up a narrow corridor toward Kincaid's guarded gulf. Waiting ahead is a bookend to old doctrine. Crossing the T returns from the textbooks to the water. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf arrays old battleships. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, salvaged, modernized, radar-equipped. PT boats and destroyers strike first in the dark, burning torpedoes and lives to force confusion. Then the broadside era ends as it should. Tightly directed, radar-laced volleys collapse Fuso and Yamashiro. The last battleship duel in history occurs under American radar and against an enemy with no air cover and no way out. The passage is closed. October 25, dawn off Samar. Kurita, having turned back, has turned again. Center force has slipped through San Bernardino Strait and now thunders down upon Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton A. Sprague's thin screen of 6 escort carriers and a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts. On the American decks fly Avengers and Wildcats built for anti-submarine patrols and support to the beach. Ahead, rising like islands, are the pagoda masts of battleships and the hard profiles of heavy cruisers. This is the nightmare the planners hoped never to see. Slow carriers cornered by a surface gun line. What follows is a collision of training, improvisation, and courage that a healthy system can produce but never guarantee. Sprague orders a retreat covered by smoke. Destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, with tin can armor and hearts built of procedure and rage, charge to torpedo range against ships that outweigh them by factors of 10. Pilots launch with partial loads, then with none, dropping depth charges and strafing to draw eyes upward. Radio nets hum without panic. In CICs and on bridges, men who have never rehearsed the specific script execute principles they know. Close to survive, confused to delay, attack to break the enemy's decision cycle. It works. Kurita's heavy cruisers suffer torpedo hits and air attacks. Chokai burns and is finished. Chikuma and Suzuya will not see dusk. Gambier Bay, the only American carrier ever sunk by gunfire, goes down fighting. Destroyers Johnston and Hull and destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts are lost buying minutes with their lives. Minutes prove decisive. Faced with a swarming air picture, smoke, torpedo threats, and imperfect information about what might be just beyond the haze, Kurita withdraws. The beachhead lives. Northward, the decoy is finally paid for in steel. Off Cape Engano, Halsey's fast carriers fall upon Ozawa. Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, takes bombs and torpedoes and capsizes. Chitose and Chiyoda follow. Zuho succumbs as well. The bait has done its work, but at the price of the last proud names on Japan's carrier list. When the wakes settle, for Japanese carriers and multiple escorts are gone. At Surigao, 2 battleships lie on the bottom. In the Sibuyan Sea, Musashi rests under a sunless layer. Off Samar, cruisers have been broken and battleships turned away by what should have been prey. In the sky over Leyte that afternoon, a new threat appears, deliberate suicide attacks that will be called kamikaze. Escort carrier St. Lo will be the first large victim of a tactic born of desperation and resource collapse. Leyte Gulf is not a single decision. It is 4 fights bound by time and distance and by a simple operational truth. The side that can keep options open longest chooses the terms. American replenishment groups, oilers, ammunition ships, and tenders keep flight decks hot over days, not hours. Ulithi, newly occupied, becomes a hinge where damaged ships rotate out and rested men rotate in. Rescue destroyers and seaplanes rake the sea for downed airmen, returning experience to the roster instead of letting it sink. Japanese commanders fight with audacity and skill, but their fuel clocks run faster. Their air search is thin, their pilots fewer and less seasoned. Their ships, once damaged, lack a repair and replenishment web to return them quickly to the line. By the evening of October 26, the Imperial Navy has spent the last of its strategic capital. It still owns valiant ships and brave crews, but it no longer owns the power to shape the ocean beyond coastal air. The invasion of Leyte proceeds. The blockade tightens. The decisive battle, sought for years as salvation, arrives only to reveal that decisiveness now belongs to the side that can fly and fight tomorrow with crews as ready as today's. On charts in Tokyo, the ink spreads over lost ships and consumed fuel. In American offices, supply tables and training rosters expand again to meet new tasks. Okinawa, blockade, and the steady compression of an empire cut from its oil. From this turning, the rest is consequence. Industry grinding toward the Ryukyus, submarines stripping the sea lanes bare, airfields inching closer to the home islands, and staff officers in a quiet capital rechecking the manpower columns that once seemed theoretical and now read like a verdict. The next pages are aftermath, numbers, reports, and the human cost written in ledgers and letters home. September 1945. Forms pile higher than ruins. The surrender is not only an act, it is an inventory. Across the Pacific world, offices that once issued orders now issue counts. In Washington, the Bureau of Naval Personnel and the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations assemble wartime strength tables. Monthly rosters, training throughputs, casualties, transfer logs, separation schedules. In Tokyo, Navy Ministry remnants and former combined fleet staff, now under Allied direction, begin to compare their pre-war intelligence sheets with captured American summaries and the first published U.S. statistical digests. The purpose is practical: repatriation, demobilization, provisioning of prisoners, the disposition of ships. But the effect is historical. The numbers reveal what the war itself had already said. Two facts stand out. First, American naval strength at its wartime peak was not measured in the hundreds of thousands imagined before 1941, but in the millions when all categories were counted: line crews, aviation, submarines, Seabees, medical corps, construction battalions, communications, training commands, shore establishments, and the service force that kept the decks fueled and armed. Second, those millions were not a static headcount. They were a living pipeline that could move men from recruit depots to schools to fleets without starving any single link. The fleet was a human archipelago whose population rose and fell by plan. Definitions mattered. What did sailor include? Officers and enlisted, obviously. But did it include naval aviation cadets mid-training? The naval construction battalions building advanced bases? The hospital corpsmen who lived with Marines on the line? The Coast Guard, folded under Navy operational control? The merchant mariners sailing under Navy convoy and armed guard? The numbers changed as the definition widened. Japanese staff officers, reconciling their own wartime categories with American ones, learned quickly that the gap between estimate and reality widened fastest in the very places their model had ignored: training cadres, shore stations, and the service force. Where pre-war intelligence had estimated a few 100,000, roughly the crews for visible hulls plus a modest shore tail, post-war compilations showed an American naval establishment that ran well beyond 2 million uniformed personnel by the end of the conflict when those broader categories were included. The precise tallies varied with the ledger you opened, the direction did not. Demobilization began even as audits were finishing. By late 1945 and through 1946, the Navy ran another kind of convoy: men homeward by the point system. Amphibious ships and carriers carried different cargo now: duffel bags, typewriters, folded flags. Training commands reversed their flow. Classrooms emptied. Temporary huts at Great Lakes and Sampson and Farragut lost their voices. Shipyards that had learned the rhythm of 3 shifts fell quiet enough to hear individual tools again. The service force, those anonymous hulls that gave the fast carriers lungs, released crews to civilian life and birthed in reserve anchorages that became floating museums of a war only months gone. Tokyo experienced a different unwinding. The Imperial Navy ceased to exist as a fighting institution. Its officers filled out forms for the victors, provided logs and plans where they survived the late war bonfires, and watched Allied officers trace shipping losses on wall maps still smelling of smoke. Younger men returned to villages and factories and learned to name peacetime trades. Older men, some already gray in 1941, wrote their first unemotional sentences about defeat. In those sentences the statistics appeared again, now stripped of the romance of decisive battle. Tonnage sunk, fuel imported, aircraft trained per month, ships repaired per week. Each column ended earlier than planned. Many ended in blanks. It is tempting in such ledgers to imagine that numbers erase courage. They do not. The men at Samar and on the Okinawa pickets do not shrink because a table says the outcome was likely once certain thresholds were crossed. What the ledgers do is explain why particular kinds of courage could change outcomes and why others could not. A destroyer's charge could break a formation and buy time because there were aircraft left to exploit that time. An escort carrier crew could survive a night of fires because there were trained replacements to relieve the exhausted the next dawn. A fleet commander could take the risk of a long-range dusk strike because refueling groups and rescue plans and replacement airframes made tomorrow possible. The statistics described the boundaries within which human decision mattered. By 1946, the audits were mature enough to enter books and official reports. American publications set the peaks and the totals for their own purposes. Budgets to come, lessons to retain, institutions to preserve. Japanese staff studies, some formal and some private, quietly noted the scale they had faced and the mismatch with pre-war forecasts. Where one pre-war estimate had pictured an American Navy staffed on the order of a few 100,000 sailors, the wartime reality, depending on inclusion of aviation, shore establishments, and the service force, had risen beyond 2 million. Whether the exact figure on a given page was a little higher or lower depending on categories, the contrast itself was the verdict. The final act of arithmetic had one more page. Ships struck from lists, men struck from rolls. The United States placed hundreds of vessels into the mothball fleets that would line rivers and bays, rust and repaint marking the slow seasons of a peace that was not yet settled. Japan, its navy abolished, watched Allied and then Japanese merchant yards begin the slow recovery of a trading nation whose future would ride civilian hulls. On both sides, the word sailor returned to its older meanings, work, weather, family, without ceasing to carry the wartime echo that had enlarged it beyond any pre-war imagination. And so the ledgers closed, the numbers settled enough to speak for themselves. What they say is not that one nation was destined to win, but that one nation entered a war with a model of the enemy that counted platforms and missed the human machine behind them. To grasp the meaning of that miscount is to ask, quietly and without drama, what scale does to strategy and what humility must do to planning, questions that belong to reflection more than to audit. War often ends not with a shout but with someone doing math in a quiet room. A column of estimates on one side. A column of realities on the other. Between them lies the distance where ships burn and men go over the side. The Japanese planners who had once believed in a tidy accounting of hulls and crews finally held the larger figure in their hands. It was not a surprise by then. Guadalcanal had hinted at it. The Philippine Sea had shouted it. Lady had made it permanent. But paper has a way of removing the last refuge of denial. The numbers closed and the shape of defeat became plain. This is not a story about destiny. It is a story about models. Count only combat decks and you miss the shadow fleet. The schools, the bases, the oilers, the repair ships, the tenders, the floating docks, the men who turn wrenches and the men who pass hoses in heavy seas. Count only today's crews and you miss tomorrow's. The United States fought a war of calendars. It learned to make time, store it, and spend it where it mattered. Japan fought with brilliance inside a shrinking hourglass. Courage met arithmetic, and arithmetic chose the ground where courage would stand. There is a human mercy in scale when it is rightly used. Crews that can rotate do not break as quickly. Pilots who can train long before they launch live longer when they finally do. Hospitals that float near the line of battle pull men back from endings that would otherwise be certain. None of this erases the terror that lived on picket stations or in the green water off Samar. It explains why some risks were taken and why the next day remained possible after the worst days. The lesson reaches past the map of the Pacific. Strategy begins in the imagination, and imagination fails when it cannot picture the systems an enemy can build. The decisive battle of doctrine gave way to the decisive rhythm of replenishment, training, and repair. A fleet became a society at sea. In that society, victory was not a single blow but the steady choice to be ready again by morning. In the end, the officer closes the ledger and sets the pencil down. Outside, the city breathes. Inside, the page is simple. Underestimate the human machine behind a nation's war, and you mistake the war itself. The sea keeps its quiet and the numbers, cold, exact, unarguable, tell the rest.